Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my post-race reaction for the Singapore or Marina Bay GP race. What was your thoughts on this race? Did you think it was boring? Did not get enough, action on track? Was there issues? Did the controversy of the McLaren drivers hitting each other and questioning whether one should be let by, would that entice you to enjoy this race? Or was the end point where we had a lot more on track action on those last 10 laps where people were coming back through the field with different tire strategies? Was that giving you enough to kind of enjoy this race? For me, I liked those aspects of it. I thought some of the interesting tire strategies at the very beginning kind of led to some of the end ones, and how that was playing out with the front runners initially, with Max Verstappen starting off on softs and not getting that front running position after he went off the line a little slow because of the slick, track, and that whole line getting not quite where they wanted to get that traction they needed. And so him falling back into that second position and then basically stuck there, kind of wearing that soft tires out quicker than they were wanting it to, trying to keep up with the, front runners with George, kind of hurt. And so that kind of played into the rest of the field where they changed and pitted. And then, of course, you had the backfield, trying to run long. And so they were coming in with a different tire strategy, getting some action through the field as well. So I think all that kind of led up to me kind of enjoying this race. And of course, I always love a night race. And with Singapore, that night race, with all the lights shining on those cars and, shining makes it really interesting to view in my book, even though if it's potentially a boring race, to help with that the lights kind of detract from how boring it could have been in general. But again, with all that action at the end of the race and some of the tire strategies for the front runners, I thought it was a fairly decent race, even though I could see people thinking it was a fairly boring race because there's not a lot of change of position in the front. So what was your thoughts? Just like normal, I go through in the back of the pack and work my way to the front, going through each driver, telling you what happened to them if I know, and how well they did in my viewpoint. And so we're going to get through this from the back with Nico Hülkenberg, who started off in 11th and ended up in 20th. He had a two-stop strategy, stopping on lap 25, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards, taking that set of hards to lap 44 before switching to a set of softs. He did have contact with Franco and had some front end plate damage on lap 44, and then he also spun around and kind of messed up his tires on lap 45 around turn 7. Kind of put him in the back foot in that regard. I think that's part of the reason why he went in, is because of that contact, and then that didn't help because I think he was getting those tires warmed up and ended up spinning around a little bit in that turn 7 area, pushing him back further in the field. So where he didn't end up where he should have regarding to his starting position. So it's not the greatest one for Nico Hülkenberg. This gets us to Pierre Gasly, who started off in the pit lane because of some changes in Parc Fermé. And then he started off in 19th and ended up in 19th. He had a two-stop strategy as well, stopping on lap 24, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards, taking that set of hards to lap 51 before switching to a set of softs. He did actually pass Hülkenberg for 19th on lap 62. Otherwise, Pierre Gasly had a fairly poor day. Didn't like this track at all in that Alpine, and they were struggling all weekend long. And so it's kind of a shame to see them in the back of the field, but that's the way that it is. I don't think it's necessarily he did a bad job running. I think that just car was not set up and suited for this track, and they're really struggling at the end of the season. So hopefully, with them supposedly concentrating on next season, that'll all change with the rule changes for next year. Then we get to Esteban Ocon, who started off in 17th and ended up in 18th. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 30, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. He did pass Yuki for 16th on lap 2. Now, I was expecting a little bit more from Ocon, especially after they said that qualifying didn't go there well, and because they had some issues, kind of like with the seatbelt buckles and some other things that were going on in that car. So I was thinking that he would be able to work his way at least a little bit farther up in the grid than he did in qualifying, which didn't work out. And so I figured the race would just, come him where he could get by at least a few people in that regard. So with him going back a spot, it didn't really turn out too well. So I think he did kind of poorly in this race. I'm not sure exactly what was going on with his car during this race system. because, you know, if it was like his teammate, he should have been able to work his way forward in that regard. So not so great for Esteban Ocon. Then we come to Gabriel Borletto, who started off in 14th and ended up in 17th. He did lose one spot at the very first lap, so not the greatest start for him. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 13, so fairly early, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards and going the rest of the way. And I think that hurt him in general because there was no safety cars or virtual safety cars in this running, so that kind of hurt him because I think they were betting on some of that. So taking that set of hards for that long a period probably wore out and kind of wore him down where he couldn't actually maintain the spots that he was looking for throughout this race. So I think part of it was strategy, part of it was, of course, that Stake F1 car's not quite where they wanted to be. I think he was hoping to be a little bit closer to where he was last time, but that didn't quite turn out this way. So I think it kind of a strategy call, trying to go from the back to the front with a different strategy, which just didn't work out for him. Then we come to Franco Colapinto, who started off in 16th and ended up in 16th. He had a really good start, gaining 3 positions on the very first lap, and he did a one-stop strategy, stopping again fairly early on lap 14, switching from a set of softs to a set of mediums. So he went and used those set of softs really quick on those first 14 laps, getting those 3 positions on that very first lap, which was good, and then switched to that mediums, which didn't quite last where they wanted it to be for the rest of the race. So I think they were, again, expecting some kind of a yellow flag caution for the whole track or a virtual safety car or something to that effect that would help them out in this regard, which really never played out. And so they kind of fell back to the wayside in this running. This gets us to Liam Lawson, who started off in 12th and ended up in 15th. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 48, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs. He did pass Gasly for 18th on lap 53, passed Ocon for 17th on lap 54, and passed Franco for 15th on lap 59. So he had a little bit of action at the very end, coming through, or near the end, coming through this track, but that strategy didn't quite play out for them on that soft set of tires, switching quite early in my regard for those soft side of tires that just couldn't hang on, and so he ended up getting pulled back into the clutches and losing some positions overall. Again, I don't think Lawson did horribly, but I don't think it was his best run for this weekend. I think he was struggling a little bit during this weekend, especially in qualifying. I know he was pushing forward, and they were happy with that regarding because of his practice sessions, but it didn't really play off in the race. So I think he has a little bit of more work to do to try to get that car under him, and yet his teammate was a little bit struggling, just more for engine issues, I think, than kind of the track situation. So hopefully he can learn some data from his teammate going forward a little bit better and kind of push forward in that running to get closer up to the front runners. This gets us to Alexander Albon, one of the Williams, which was interesting because they were disqualified from the qualifying session because of a rear wing deflection test that failed after qualifying. So they were only let in to race at the discretion of the people. So they ended up starting off at the back of the pack instead of where they qualified at. But it didn't really matter because Alex decided to make some changes during Parc Fermé, so he started from the pit, which means he started off in 20th and ended up in 14th. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 42, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs. So his strategy ended up working a little bit better, I think, on that Williams. I don't know why, but he was able to pass Stroll for 18th on lap 49, pass Gasly for 17th on lap 52, and pass Borletto for 15th on lap 55. So I think he was far enough in the back of the pack that he couldn't gain enough to get into the point area, unlike his teammate was just getting that extra point. But I think that strategy for them going a little bit longer and then switching for a soft worked better than most other teams trying to play off that strategy. I'm not sure if that Williams was a little bit better on that soft tires than the other teams or what. But I think Alexander Albon did a fairly good job starting from the back of the pack and making his way up to 14th. I know it's not quite where he wanted to be. And I think he was trying to get it closer to that, last point marker, but didn't quite play out that well. Then we come to Lance Stroll, who started off in 15th and ended up in 13th. He did gain one spot at the very first lap, so a decent start for him, but then just fell back with some issues with those tires, as he was saying that those mediums felt like they were 100-year-old mediums at one point, which was kind of interesting. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 38, switching from a set of softs to a set of mediums. So he went pretty long on that set of softs all the way to lap 38 to start off the race. So that was kind of interesting, but I know when he switched to those mediums, he didn't like the mediums at all in that Aston Martin, so we'll have to see if they can play out and figure out what's going on there relative to his teammate, which I think did a fairly good job, except for that pit stop that kind of pushed him back a little bit farther in the grid. But anyway, Lance Stroll passed Albon for 18th on lap 49, passed Bortoleto for 14th on lap 55, and passed Franco for 13th on lap 59. So he got himself up a couple of spots, but not quite where he should be. Closer to that front runner, getting some more points for Aston Martin. So we'll have to see if they can continue to push forward in his last 6 races or not. This gets us to Yuki Tsunoda, who started off in 13th and ended up in 12th. He did lose 3 spots at the very first lap, so he had a very poor start. Did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 13, switching from those set of softs to a set of hards, and then passed Franco for 14th on lap 42. So that soft set of tires did not work for Yuki at the very beginning. He didn't gain any spots. In fact, he lost 3 spots even with those soft tires, so something was going on. I'm not sure if he was on that slick side of the track during that start or what, but he wasn't able to maintain those positions or even gain positions. So I think this is kind of on Yuki in this regard. I know that second Red Bull is tricky to drive, but we'll have to wait and see if he can really put that together. But it seems like his teammate is getting more familiar, and they're putting that Red Bull closer to where they can get on the front row, even in the pole positions and maintaining those race positions these last 3 races. So we'll have to hopefully play that down to Yuki where he can get good enough in that car. So in this race, I don't think he did well enough in that, especially losing those 3 spots at the very beginning, which we expect more from Yuki. This gets us to Isaac Haijar, who started off in 8th and ended up in 11th. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 20, switching from a set of softs to a set of hards. He did pass Alonso for 13th on lap 37, and he had engine issues where he had to nurse and try to really placate it, and he was really not happy with that, complaining about his, this engine multiple times throughout this race and why it's always the engine's issues, what's going on with that engine. So hopefully they can figure out what's going on and be able to get a better car for him in the future. But unfortunately, he ended up dropping back from the 8th position from the points, just outside of the points in this regard. I know he was playing it really defensively, keeping Alonso back, and Alonso even was kind of complaining against how well Isaac Haijar was defending against him in that kind of a defunct car with the engine issues that everybody kind of knew that they had. So he was trying to keep those issues going, keep him up, going, in front, playing defensively against Alonso, and Alonso wasn't really happy about that. But I think that was kind of interesting to see, some of these tactics get thrown back at Alonso as well. So I think it was a good run for Isaac Haijar with that engine issue. Unfortunately, it didn't quite get into the points where he needed to be. This gets us to our top 10, where we find Carlos Sainz, who again with those Williams were disqualified in the qualifying session because of that rear wing deflection test failure. But he was granted to be able to go ahead and race. He just started at the back of the pack, where he ended up starting off in 18th. He ended up ending his race and going all the way up to the 10th position. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 50, switching from a set of mediums to a set of softs. So he went pretty far into the race on that set of mediums and switching to that set of softs for only that last 12 laps or so. So it kind of paid off for him, I think, in this regard. He did pass Stroll for 14th on lap 52. Passed Bortoleto for 13th on lap 53, passed Franco for 12th on lap 54, passed Yuki for 11th on lap 58, and passed Isaac Haijar for 10th on lap 60. So overall, I think Carlos did a really good job in that Williams car, and I think he probably could have been driver of the day if it was not for Alonso, which I totally agree with. But him coming back from the back of the field to get to the points was a really good thing, and I think he kind of looks like he could deserve that as well. So just to throw that thought in there, what was your thoughts on how Carlos drove? We get to Oliver Behrman, who started off in 9th and ended up in 9th. He did lose 1 spot at the very beginning of the first lap, so he kind of had a bad start, but was able to gain that spot back throughout the race and retain that spot, and get some more points for Haas, which is always good to see. He did stop on lap 23, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards, and he passed Albon for 13th on lap 25. He did also get a black and white flag for track limits on lap 59, so if he had one more track limit, he would have gotten a 5-second penalty, so he was right there on the edge of that from that point forward, so he was able to maintain his car within the track limits, keeping that position, not getting that 5-second penalty, which was good to see. But it was interesting that he got all the way up to the edge on that side in this race. Then we come to Lewis Hamilton, who started off in 6th and ended up in 7th. He did lose one spot at the very first lap, so not the greatest start for Lewis Hamilton, but he did a 2-stop race, stopping on lap 24, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards, taking that set of hards to lap 46, where he switched to a set of softs. And then he had a bad pit stop, about 3.5 seconds, so not horrible, but not a great pit stop for him in that second Ferrari. And he did pass lap 56 for 6th position. And he had a braking issue around lap 60, which he just fell off the cliff with. And he ended up going off track limits a couple more times, which put him at a total of 4 track limits, which gave him a 5-second penalty at the very end of the race, which was after everybody crossed the line. So it dropped him back down to that 7th position. That gets us to Fernando Alonso, who started off in 10th and ended up in 7th. So that, with Lewis Hamilton dropping back down because of that 5-second penalty, that bumped Fernando up to that 7th position. He did gain one spot at the very beginning of the first lap, so that was a good start for him. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 27, switching from a set of softs to a set of mediums. He passed Hijar for 8th on lap 3, had a really slow pit stop, about 9.2 seconds, which dropped him back in the field, and he was fairly upset about that, which I could understand, but he was able to work his way back up and get some decent points, especially with Lewis Hamilton dropping back at the end. So that helped him out as well. So he ended up passing Hijar for 13th on lap 37, passed Albon for 11th on lap 42, passed Behrman for 10th on lap 45, and passed Sainz for 9th on lap 48, and then got bumped up to that 7th position overall in this race. So that was really good to see for Fernando Alonso coming back from that bad pit stop. I think he deserves the driver of the day because he, that bad pit stop still came back up into the field and just kind of worked his magic to get those pretty good points for the Aston Martin in that case. So good on Fernando Alonso. This gets us to Charles Leclerc, who started off in 7th and ended up in 6th. He gained 2 spots at the very first lap, so a good start for him. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping at lap 21, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. He did pass Hulkenberg for 9th on lap 22, and passed Hamilton for 6th on lap 61. So overall, I think Charles Leclerc was struggling in that Ferrari. That weren't quite where they needed to be on both the Ferraris. But I think Charles was kind of suffering a little bit more than Hamilton during this weekend. And it just kind of played out for him to be in that regard. So I think he did a decent job. And I think he kind of worked his way up there, keeping the Ferraris in the mix, even though it wasn't quite where they wanted to be, pushing for those front podium positions. This gets us to the top 5, where we find Kimi Antonelli, who started off in 4th and ended up in 5th. He did lose 2 spots at the very first lap, so it had a pretty poor start for him. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 25, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. He had a double stack pit stop with a 2.4 second pit, and he passed Leclerc for 5th on lap 54. So overall, I think Kimi did a okay job. That start didn't really help him out too much in this regard, but he was able to call out his way back and gain one of those positions back, ending up into that 5th position. So still some pretty good points for Mercedes overall, and a decent showing for him. He just needs to kind of focus in a little bit more and kind of put out all the distractions that he sees in this race and things, so that he can really focus in on what he needs to do. He's still young, so he still has some time to do that. And I think with that contract with Mercedes, I think that's all settled. So hopefully that'll help him concentrate a little bit more on these last few races. Then we come to Oscar Piastri. He started off in 3rd and ended up in 4th. He did lose one spot at the very first lap to his teammate. He did one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 27, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. He did have contact with Lando on lap 1, turn 1, and he had a slow pit stop of 5.2 seconds, which didn't help him out either. Now, my view of that contact is yes, there was contact, but I think it was kind of in favor for Lando. Yes, Lando was trying to be fairly aggressive in that regard, trying to maintain right behind Max, and I think he kind of got sucked into that tailwind of Max, kind of braking a little bit harder than he needed to, sliding into the back of Max, trying to avoid him, and kind of coming into the side of Oscar due to that. So yes, there were some issues with Lando's driving, but I think it was, that first lap, first turn kind of aspect of it that played out. I know it didn't play well with Oscar. I think Oscar, kind of hard to judge. I think Oscar was on the outside of that in the initial turn. So I think he's the one that should have backed off a little bit in that regard, because he was up alongside of his teammate. So in that regard, I think it was kind of Oscar's fault in that regard, but of course it was Lando's fault for getting pulled in from that air on Max and having to take those evasive actions in that regard. So it's kind of a racing incident in my viewpoint, so it didn't really play out, and I definitely don't think the team should have gotten involved. Of course, I don't think they should have gotten involved in the other two scenarios either, so we'll have to see how that plays out with that team dynamic in these last 6 races as they go in for that championship, see if they get a little bit more aggressive around each other and a little bit more not quite as clean in those passes, and see if that kind of plays out, especially after the championship that McLaren have won, so they don't have to worry about that in this running. This gets us to Lando Norris, who started off in 5th and ended up in 3rd. He did gain 2 spots at the very first lap, so he had a really good start, kind of coming down that inside and then kind of putting some pressure and touching, of course, Max Verstappen, who was in front of him, and Oscar, who was to his right, kind of forcing his way through in that regard. I think that was kind of aggressive, but like I just said, it kind of worked out for him, and there's some of it his fault and some of it is Oscar's fault. So overall, I think it was more of a racing incident, and so it didn't need to really penalized, and it didn't really need to do anything with the race. He did have one stop strategy, stopping on lap 26, being the first person to stop, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards, and his stop was fairly good with a 2.1 second stop, so that was played out, and so he chose correctly on that regard. So I think if he had chosen that second pit stop, let his teammate pass, he may have gotten the bad pit stop as well, which might have hurt him in that running as well. So with all of that, he did have a little bit of wing damage when he hit Max. So he maintained that race with that wing damage and still maintained that. So I think he did a really good job in this race overall. Yes, there were some mistakes but he was able to get up into that second position, third position, and maintain that for the rest of the race. Now, he did put a little bit more pressure on Max, not quite able to make a good, clean pass on him. And with all the other stuff in play, I think that kind of hindered him in his attempts, but he was able to at least maintain that third position. So a good job for Lando Norris in this run. This gets us to Max Verstappen, who started off in 2nd and ended up in 2nd. He had a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 19, switching from a set of softs to a set of hards. So he was hoping that set of softs would, boost him in that first part of this race, and it quite did that with that slick side of the race, that dirty side, that whole left side of the race. Didn't quite get the jump at the start what they wanted it to, so he kind of got back and had to play a little bit different strategy in that regard, kind of making everybody else, cut off him as he was, pitting a little bit earlier than other people are expecting to. He did have some brake issues as well, that rear brakes that were having him kind of make changes on that car to try to make it more balanced. And at one point he even, had locked up in lap 36, where he almost hit the wall in that regard as well. So I know he wasn't happy with the way that car was driving and feeling. So it was really good for him to maintain that second position throughout this race, and even put a little bit of pressure on George in the meantime, even with a hindered car. So really good job for Max Verstappen. And we come to George Russell, who started off in 1st and ended up in 1st. He had a good start keeping up the lead, so that was good. He did a one-stop strategy, stopping on lap 25, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. And he had a good pit stop with a 2.5 second pit stop that kept him ahead of Max with fairly good gap in that running, and we'll see a little bit later how that plays out. But he was able to maintain that lead throughout this race and kind of play it out. I know there was some pressure at some points in here and there, but he was able to really keep out in the lead, and really good job for George Russell. To kind of give you a breakdown of how this race went, we can kind of look at this sheet here and see, like at lap 5 it was a 2.8 second lead for Russell over Max. At lap 10 it was a 5.15 second lead for Russell over Max. By lap 15 it was up to a 7.72 second lead for Russell over Max. And then this is kind of weird, where I looked at this at lap 25 because this is the lap that Russell pitted. So it was only a 2.81 second lead for Russell over Lando because Max had already pitted. And then things settled out again about the halfway mark. We have lap 31. We have a 3.52 second lead for Russell over Max. Lap 45, it was a 3.71 second lead for Russell over Max. Lap 50, it was up to a 5.89 second lead for Russell over Max. And it was 5 laps later, at lap 55, it was a 5.98 second lead for Russell over Max. Lap 60 was down to a 5.62 second lead for Russell over Max. And at the very end of the race, 2 laps later, it was down to a 5.423 second lead for Russell over Max. So you can see here that Russell kind of had it in hand throughout this race, kind of ebbed and flowed a little bit, but in generally Russell was kind of in the dominant car and was able to maintain that gap fairly easily throughout this race, even though there were some points in time where there was a little bit of tension on whether anything could happen to Russell. And so we can look here and see that this is right before Max went into the pits. And we kind of see that gap here. So you can see Verstappen was kind of down on Russell at this point in time, right before Max decides to pit. But you can see that really small gap between Max and Lando. And so that was the pressure and trying to figure out where that was going to go. And then, of course, Oscar was a little bit back farther than that. But this is, right before that lap 20 section where, Max came in and pitted. And kind of going to give the gap right at that first section. And then we get to the middle section here. This is, of course, after Russell, Lando, and Oscar have pitted. You can see that here, and where we come back out, and we kind of look at that gap, so we can still see a fairly decent 3.8 second gap between Russell and Max, and then Lando coming back out, roughly that same time period behind Max. So a pretty good gap there, but what I thought was kind of interesting to see in this graph was that you can see, Russell coming out, pitting, and then having that gap down to like, 3.5 seconds between him and Max when he first came out of the pits. So that kind of played off in case they had a bad pit stop that would have played out, potentially, giving Max the lead and having to deal with that. And then also you can see that, where Lando went in their pits and kind of went behind Max, trying to cut off, all those situations. And then, of course, we see how all that played out with Leclerc coming in that first red line down there, way at the back, but kind of putting a little bit more pressure on Oscar after Oscar pitted in that scenario. So we had those kind of situations that kind of looked interesting to me, how that played out. And then, of course, at the end of the race, I thought this was really interesting if you can see this. So you have the gaps. Of course, Russell was fairly ahead of Max in this running at this, the end in this scenario. But I'd love to see this, if you can see this line here where it just drops off the field, where that's, Lewis Hamilton and his brake issue. He was gaining ground on that soft tire, then kind of just went to hell when he had that brake issue and just could not maintain it and barely got ahead of Alonso at the end. But then, of course, he had that 5-second penalty, which dropped him back behind him. So I thought that was some interesting viewpoints, from this track, deltas that we can look at through here through MultiView. So if you find this interesting, I would like to see if you would make a comment of that, see if I could continue putting these things in this, podcast or not. What did this do to our driver standings? Of course, we have Oscar still in the lead with 336 points. Lando Norris a little bit closer to him with 314 points. Max gained some ground with 273 points. And George with 237 points. So those are the front runners. And we see Fernando Alonso jumping up to that 11th position now with 36 points. Jumping over and keeping Carlos the same after his points there with in 12th with 32 points. But Lance Stroll dropping back and Liam Lawson dropping back in that driver's standings. And for the constructor standing, of course, we know that McLaren won their constructor standings. So they have now world champions on the field for the constructors with 650 points. Mercedes behind them with 325 points. Ferrari's a little bit farther with 289 and Red Bull with 290. So here we kind of see some of those gaps in running. And of course, we have to see how that plays out in the future. So what is coming up next? We have the USA Circuit of the Americas, or COTA, and it'll be on October 18th where we have a sprint race. So we will start off with a sprint race before our main GP race on that Saturday, October 18th. It will have a length of 3.426 miles with 19 laps being run for a total race distance of 65.087 miles. The lap record holder currently is 1 minute 36.169 seconds with Charles Leclerc in 2019. It was first introduced, of course, in 2012. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.